What does the face of pure evil look like to you? Do you imagine a scarred monster, a screaming tyrant, or perhaps something far more terrifying? A man who looks exactly like a savior? If you were lying on an operating table in Berlin in the mid-1930s, bleeding and broken, there was perhaps no surgeon in the entire world you would rather see standing over you than Karl Brandt. He was young, he was brilliant, and he possessed a bedside manner that could calm the most terrified patient. He was the picture of Aryan perfection, a man who swore the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm. Yet he would go down in history not for the lives he saved, but for the millions he helped to exterminate. How does a man dedicated to the preservation of life become the architect of industrial mass murder? To understand the darkness of the 20th century, we must look past the dictators and the generals, and look instead into the eyes of the doctor who stood quietly in their shadow. This is the story of a paradox that continues to haunt the medical world to this day. When we think of the Nazi regime, we think of the Gestapo, the SS, and the chaotic violence of the battlefield. But there was another war being fought, a silent war waged in sterile white rooms, under the bright lights of operating theaters, where the weapons were not guns, but syringes and scalpels. At the center of this silent war stood Karl Brandt. To his friends and colleagues, he was a man of high culture and deep intellect. He was not a thug from the streets. He was a scientist. He was a man who believed, with a terrifying conviction, that he was acting out of mercy. This is the most chilling aspect of his character. He did not view himself as a killer. Until his final breath, he saw himself as a pioneer, a man willing to make the hard choices that others were too weak to make. Imagine, for a moment, the atmosphere of Germany in the years leading up to the war. It was a nation obsessed with biological purity, and science was its new religion. In this world, the doctor was elevated to the status of a priest. Karl Brandt was the high priest of this new order. He was handsome, with a sharp jawline and an intense, thoughtful gaze that captivated those around him, including Adolf Hitler himself. When you look at photographs of Brandt from this era, you do not see a madman. You see a professional. You see a man you would trust with your life. And that is exactly what makes him the most dangerous man in the room. The tragedy of Karl Brandt is not just a story about one man. It is a story about the seduction of science without morality. It forces us to ask a question that is as relevant today as it was in 1939. What happens when a society decides that some lives are worth more than others? Karl Brandt did not start his career with the intent to murder. He started with the intent to heal. He was a rising star in the German medical community, a community that was, at the time, the envy of the world. German medicine was the gold standard. It was the home of Nobel Prize winners and revolutionary breakthroughs. Brandt was a product of this excellence. He was skilled, efficient, and driven by a desire to serve his country. But somewhere along the line, the definition of healing began to twist. For Brandt, the patient was no longer the individual human being lying in the hospital bed. The patient became the folk, the nation itself. And if the nation was the patient, then the weak, the disabled, and the mentally ill were viewed not as people needing care, but as a cancer needing to be excised. This was the intellectual trap that Brandt walked into, and it was a trap that would lead him to the gallows. He replaced the Hippocratic Oath with loyalty to a dictator, and in doing so, he turned the hospital from a place of refuge into a waiting room for death. We often like to believe that evil is easy to spot. We want the villains of history to look like villains. We want them to be foaming at the mouth, irrational, and obviously deranged. It makes us feel safe. It makes us feel that we would recognize such evil if we saw it today. But Karl Brandt denies us that comfort. He was soft-spoken. He was polite. He was kind to his staff and devoted to his family. He wore a crisp, clean uniform and spoke in complete, rational sentences. When he stood trial years later at Nuremberg, he did not scream or shout. He calmly explained his logic, as if he were lecturing a class of medical students. He spoke of humane death and scientific necessity. He spoke of economics and resources. He sanitized murder until it sounded like a medical procedure. This creates a cognitive dissonance that is hard to shake. How can the same hands that delicately stitched wounds and set broken bones also sign the paperwork that sent thousands of children to the gas chambers? How can a mind trained to understand the intricate miracle of human biology also devised the most efficient methods to destroy it. This is the enigma of Karl Brandt. He represents the ultimate betrayal of trust. The doctor is the one person in society who has absolute power over our bodies when we are at our most vulnerable. We trust them because we believe in their inherent goodness. Brandt shattered that trust on a global scale. As we peel back the layers of his life in this series, we will not just be looking at a biography of a war criminal. We will be dissecting the anatomy of a moral collapse. We will see how ambition can blind a man to reality. We will see how ideology can override empathy. And we will see how the road to the gas chambers was paved not by soldiers, but by doctors in white coats. We are about to step into a world where right and wrong were inverted, where killing was called therapy, and where the most educated men in the country became its most efficient executioners. Karl Brandt was the golden boy of the Third Reich, the man who stood at the right hand of the devil, holding a stethoscope. But before the blood, before the trials, and before the hangman's noose, there was just a young, ambitious surgeon looking for his place in history. He wanted to be great. He wanted to save Germany. And in his quest to be a savior, he became something that nightmares are made of. To understand how the Holocaust happened, we cannot just look at the hate. We must look at the cold, calculating logic of men like Brandt. So, let us go back to the beginning. Let us go back to before the world burned, to a time when Karl Brandt was just a man with a medical degree and a promising future. Let us trace the steps of the man who proved that the distance between the healer and the executioner is terrifyingly short. This is not a story for the faint of heart. It is a descent into the coldest reaches of the human soul. This is the story of Karl Brandt. Is it possible that the fate of millions of innocent people was sealed not in a war room or a political rally, but by the screech of tires and the shattering of glass on a quiet country road? History often hinges on the most trivial of moments, on chance encounters that seem insignificant at the time, but send ripples through the decades. For Karl Brandt, that moment came in the summer of 1932. It was a moment that would pluck him from the obscurity of a promising medical career and drop him directly into the inner sanctum of the most dangerous man on earth. Before the camps, before the gas chambers, and before the world collapsed into darkness, there was a car accident. And from the wreckage of that accident rose the man who would become the golden boy of the Third Reich. To understand how a doctor could lose his soul, we first have to understand what he had to sell. In the early 1930s, Karl Brandt was everything a young German professional aspired to be. Born in the disputed territory of Alsace, he had grown up with the sting of national humiliation after the First World War. Like many of his generation, he carried a burning desire to restore pride to his identity. He was not a political radical screaming in beer halls. He was a man of science. He had studied under the finest professors, and he possessed a talent for traumatic surgery that was undeniable. He was 28 years old, ambitious, and looking for a purpose. But talent alone does not make history. You need opportunity. And opportunity arrived in the form of a disaster. In August of 1932, Adolf Hitler was campaigning furiously across Germany. His entourage was a traveling circus of high-speed Mercedes limousines, racing from town to town. In one of those cars sat Wilhelm Bruckner, Hitler's chief adjutant and one of his closest confidants. On a winding road in Reit im Winkel, the driver lost control. The car careened off the road and smashed into a tree. Bruckner was critically injured, suffering from a severe skull fracture and a crushed eye. The situation was dire. Hitler, a man known for his intense paranoia and hypochondria, was frantic. He needed the best, and he needed him immediately. Karl Brandt was the surgeon on call at the nearest hospital in Traunstein. When the call came in, he didn't know he was about to operate on the right-hand man of the future dictator. He simply saw a patient with life-threatening injuries. Brandt worked with a cold, precise efficiency. He operated on Bruckner's brain, stabilizing a condition that should have been fatal. He saved the man's life. When Hitler arrived at the hospital, pacing the corridors in his trench coat, he found a young doctor who was calm, collected, and remarkably successful. Hitler looked at Brandt, and he didn't just see a surgeon. He saw an image. He saw the biological ideal he had been preaching about in his speeches. Brandt was tall, with sharp features and a stoic demeanor. He looked like a poster child for the Aryan race. But more importantly, he had performed a miracle for someone Hitler loved. In the chaotic, paranoid world of the Nazi leadership, competence was valuable, but loyalty was priceless. Hitler, who famously distrusted the established medical elite, decided then and there that this young man belonged to him. This was the seductive power of the regime. It didn't always demand blood at first. Sometimes, it simply offered a promotion. Hitler invited Brandt to join his personal staff as his escort physician. Imagine the intoxication of that offer. You are a young doctor from the provinces, and suddenly, the most powerful and mesmerizing political figure in Europe is asking you to travel the world with him. It was a Faustian bargain wrapped in a golden ticket. Brandt accepted. He didn't join because he wanted to kill. He joined because he wanted to be near the center of the universe. From that moment on, Brandt's life became a whirlwind of glamour and power. He was no longer working long shifts in a municipal hospital. He was dining at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps. He became a fixture in the private court of the Führer. He wasn't just a doctor, he was a friend. He played with Hitler's dogs. He charmed Eva Braun. He was the polite, well-dressed intellectual who gave the rough, violent inner circle a veneer of respectability. This period of Brandt's life is crucial because it normalized the abnormal. Living in the Wolf's Lair, or the Berghof, Brandt was insulated from the reality of the streets. He was surrounded by a cult of personality, where Hitler's word was not just law, it was biological truth. If Hitler said that the nation was a body and he was the brain, then Brandt, as the doctor, began to see his role not as treating individual sickness, but as maintaining the health of the body politic. The transformation was subtle. It started with the uniform. Brandt traded his white coat for the field gray of the SS. He looked dashing in it. He rose rapidly through the ranks, eventually becoming a major general in the Waffen-SS. But the uniform does something to a man's mind. It creates a barrier between him and the rest of the world. It confers authority that hasn't been earned. Brandt began to view himself as a soldier of biology. His enemies were not opposing armies, but bacteria, genetics, and anything that threatened the purity of the German blood. During these golden years, before the war truly turned the world into a graveyard, Brandt was living a fantasy. He married the champion swimmer Annie Rayborn, a match that Hitler himself encouraged and celebrated. They were the perfect couple of the new Germany. Success followed success. But beneath the surface of this high society life, a rot was setting in. Brandt's proximity to Hitler meant that he was constantly exposed to the dictator's darkest obsessions. Hitler would rant for hours about the weakness of modern society, about how Christianity had softened the German people, and how nature required the strong to dominate the weak. Brandt listened. And because he worshipped the man speaking, he began to internalize these rants as scientific fact. He stopped thinking like a doctor whose duty is to the single patient in front of him. He started thinking like a state planner. He began to believe that compassion for the weak was a cruelty to the strong. This intellectual shift is the most terrifying part of his rise. It proves that you don't need to be a sadist to become a monster. You just need to be an ideologue. You just need to believe, truly believe, that the end justifies the means. By the late 1930s, Karl Brandt was untouchable. He was the golden boy, standing tall in the photographs, usually just a step behind Hitler. He had the world at his feet. But the debt for his rapid ascent was about to come due. The man who had saved a life on a roadside in 1932 was about to be asked to take lives on an industrial scale. The car accident had proven his skill with a scalpel. Now, his master wanted to know if he had the stomach to use that scalpel to cut out the cancer of society. The trap was set. The golden cage was locked. And the doctor was about to become the executioner. The descent was over. The nightmare was about to begin. At what point does the alleviation of suffering cross the invisible line into the commission of a crime? And what happens when the hand rocking the cradle decides to stop the heart? We often think of the greatest crimes against humanity as being born from hatred, but in the case of Karl Brandt, the road to hell was paved with a twisted, suffocating form of pity. The nightmare did not begin with a scream in a concentration camp. It began with a letter, written by a father who loved his child enough to want him dead. In the early months of 1939, a peculiar request landed on the desk of the Chancellery in Berlin. It was from a man named Knauer, living near Leipzig. His wife had given birth to a son, a boy named Gerhard. But Gerhard was not the strong, healthy Aryan child the propaganda posters promised. He was born blind, missing a leg, and appeared to be developmentally disabled. In a country that worshipped physical perfection, this child was seen as a broken object. The father, distraught and desperate, did not ask for money or medical aid. He petitioned the Führer for permission to have his son put to sleep. Hitler did not dismiss the letter. In fact, it was exactly the opportunity he had been waiting for. He needed a test case, a precedent to validate a dark theory that had been brewing in his mind for years, the concept of life unworthy of life. But he needed someone he could trust to pull the trigger, someone who would not flinch at the moral weight of the task. He turned to his golden boy. He turned to Karl Brandt. Hitler instructed Brandt to travel to Leipzig, examine the infant, and if the father's description was accurate, to grant the child a mercy death. This was the moment. This was the precipice. Until now, Brandt had been a healer. He had fixed broken bones and stitched wounds. Now, he was being asked to use his medical authority to authorize an execution. Brandt drove to Leipzig. He stood over the crib of baby Gerhard. He did not see a human being with a soul. He saw a biological error. With clinical detachment, he confirmed the diagnosis. He spoke to the local doctors, and under his instruction, the child was given a lethal injection. Gerhard died quietly, the first victim of a program that would eventually consume millions. To Brandt, this was not murder. In his mind, he had performed an act of kindness. He had liberated the child from a miserable existence, and the parents from a burden. But the death of baby Gerhard was not an isolated tragedy. It was a key unlocking a door that should have remained forever shut. When Brandt returned to Berlin, Hitler didn't just thank him. He authorized him. Hitler signed a secret decree, backdated to September 1st, 1939, the day World War II began. It was a single paragraph written on his personal stationery, charging Karl Brandt and Philipp Bühler with the responsibility to expand the authority of physicians, so that patients considered incurable can be granted a mercy death. With that stroke of a pen, the Hippocratic Oath was effectively outlawed in Germany. The doctor was no longer the servant of the patient. He was the judge, jury, and executioner for the state. This was the birth of the T4 program. Brandt did not recoil from this new responsibility. He embraced it with the organizational zeal of a bureaucrat. He helped establish a system where questionnaires were sent to hospitals and asylums. Doctors who never even saw the patients would mark a plus sign for death or a minus sign for life, based solely on a piece of paper. The specific tragedy of one child was converted into a statistical equation. Brandt's tragedy is that he intellectualized the horror until it disappeared. He convinced himself that by killing the incurable, he was strengthening the healthy. He stood at the top of a pyramid of death, looking down not with malice, but with a terrifying sense of righteousness. He had crossed the line. The white coat was no longer a symbol of hope. It was a camouflage for the ultimate crime. The slippery slope was no longer a metaphor. Brandt was sliding down it at breakneck speed, and he was dragging the entire German medical establishment down with him. The killing had begun. If a government decides to murder its own citizens, not in secret dungeons, but in buildings marked as hospitals, using the language of care to disguise the machinery of death, would you be brave enough to see the truth? Or would you simply believe the lie because it is too comfortable to question? This is the terrifying reality of the T4 program, a moment in history where the line between a sanctuary and a slaughterhouse didn't just blur, it vanished completely. Karl Brandt had successfully crossed the threshold with the murder of a single child, but his ambition, and the ambition of the regime he served, was far greater than individual cases. They faced a logistical problem. There were simply too many unworthy lives in Germany to be eliminated by individual injections. It was slow, it was psychologically taxing for the doctors, and it was inefficient. To solve this, Brandt did not look to medicine. He looked to industry. He transformed the act of killing from a medical procedure into an assembly line. The operation was headquartered in a nondescript villa in Berlin at Tiergartenstrasse 4. From this address, the program took its code name, T4. Here, Brandt and his associates didn't wear blood-spattered aprons. They wore suits. They sat at mahogany desks, drank coffee, and processed stacks of registration forms. This was the birth of the desk murderer. Brandt created a bureaucracy so detached from reality that signing a death warrant became as mundane as approving a supply order for bandages. The terror began with the arrival of the buses. In asylum towns across Germany, they became known as the gray buses. Their windows were painted over or covered with curtains to prevent the passengers from looking out and the public from looking in. When these buses pulled up to a psychiatric ward or a home for the disabled, panic often ensued. The patients, despite their conditions, often sensed the danger. They were told they were being transferred to better facilities with more specialized care. They were told they were going to a place where they could rest. But the only rest awaiting them was the eternal kind. Brandt's most dark contribution to this era was his focus on efficiency. He realized that to kill tens of thousands of people, he needed a method that was quick, cheap, and spared the executioners the psychological trauma of pulling a trigger. The solution was carbon monoxide gas. Under Brandt's supervision, 6 killing centers were established across Germany and Austria, places like Hadamar and Hartheim. These were castles and hospitals converted into factories of death. The process was diabolical in its deception. When the patients arrived, they were stripped of their clothes and checked by a doctor, not to save them, but to identify gold teeth that could be extracted later. They were then led into a room labeled inhalation room or shower room. They were told it was for disinfection. The doors were sealed and the gas was turned on. Brandt had reviewed the medical data on carbon monoxide. He knew it was odorless and invisible. He argued it was the most humane way to extinguish a life. But there was nothing humane about the panic that ensued when the gas filled the room, the desperate clawing at the walls, and the final pile of bodies that tumbled out when the doors were reopened. What makes Brandt's role so chilling is the administrative cover-up he orchestrated. He knew that the German public was not ready to accept mass murder openly. So, he built a wall of lies. Families of the victims would receive an urn of ashes and a standard condolence letter. The cause of death was always fabricated. A patient who had lost their appendix years ago might be listed as dying of appendicitis. A healthy young man might be listed as dying of a heart attack. It was a massive, coordinated gaslighting of an entire nation. Between 1940 and 1941, over 70,000 people were murdered under this program. 70,000 human beings, mothers, fathers, veterans of the First World War, and children, were processed through Brandt's machine. He reviewed the reports. He watched the numbers rise, and he felt a sense of accomplishment. In his worldview, he was cleansing the Garden of Germany of its weeds. He was freeing up hospital beds and saving food for the soldiers at the front. He had turned the Hippocratic Oath upside down. Instead of protecting the weak from the strong, he was protecting the strong from the weak. This phase of Brandt's life serves as the grim prototype for what was to come. The gas chambers, the fake showers, the extraction of gold teeth, the burning of bodies, all of these techniques were perfected by Karl Brandt and his T4 staff long before they were deployed at Auschwitz or Treblinka. The Holocaust did not start in the concentration camps of Poland. It started in the hospitals of Germany, supervised by a man who was sworn to heal. Brandt had successfully turned medicine into a weapon of mass destruction. He had proven that with enough authority and enough paperwork, you could make murder acceptable. But the war was turning, and the hunger of the regime was growing. The sick and disabled were no longer enough. The machine Brandt built was hungry for new victims, and soon he would turn his eyes toward the concentration camps, where human beings would cease to be patients and become raw material for his experiments. When we look at a human being, we see a life, a story, and a universe of potential. But what happens when a scientist looks at that same human being and sees only a biological container, a disposable object to be broken, frozen, and infected in the name of progress? The most terrifying aspect of Karl Brandt's legacy is not just that he killed the unwanted, but that he harvested the living. As the war turned against Germany, the hospitals of the T4 program were replaced by the barbed wire of the concentration camps, and the doctor became something far worse than an executioner. He became a mad scientist with an unlimited supply of human guinea pigs. By 1942, the dream of a quick German victory had died in the snows of Russia. The Wehrmacht was bleeding dry, and the Nazi leadership was desperate for any advantage that could save their soldiers. Karl Brandt, now appointed as the Reich Commissioner for Sanitation and Health, sat at the apex of this desperation. He was given total control over the medical resources of the empire. In any other time, a doctor would look for cures. But in Brandt's world, the cure for the German soldier was the suffering of the concentration camp prisoner. Brandt operated under a chilling utilitarian logic. He argued that since German men were dying by the thousands on the front lines to protect the state had the right to demand the lives of enemies, Jews, gypsies, political prisoners, to save those soldiers. It was a mathematical equation of blood. If torturing one prisoner could yield data that saved 10 pilots, Brandt considered it not just acceptable, but ethically necessary. This logic birthed the horrors of Dachau, Buchenwald, and Ravensbrück. Under Brandt's administrative umbrella, the camps were transformed into vast, open-air laboratories. Consider the freezing experiments. The Luftwaffe was losing pilots who crashed into the freezing waters of the North Sea. They needed to know how long a man could survive in ice water and how best to revive him. Instead of using animal models, they used prisoners. Men were forced into tanks of ice water and held there until they lost consciousness or their hearts stopped. Brandt received the reports. He read the data on body temperature drops and rewarming techniques. He didn't hear the screams. He only saw the graphs. But the horror did not stop at freezing. At Ravensbrück, doctors conducted bone, muscle, and nerve transplantation experiments. To simulate battlefield wounds, they would slice open the legs of healthy women, often members of the Polish resistance, and remove sections of bone or muscle to see if they could be grafted onto others. They deliberately rubbed dirt, glass, and bacteria into the open wounds to test the efficacy of sulfonamide drugs. These women were not anesthetized for the benefit of their comfort. They were treated like broken machinery. Brandt was not always the one holding the scalpel, but he was the architect who built the roof under which these crimes occurred. He visited the camps. He saw the subjects. He witnessed the degradation of human beings who were reduced to numbers tattooed on their arms. Yet he never intervened to stop it. In fact, he encouraged it. He believed that these prisoners were human material, to be used until exhausted. The most frightening part is that Brandt believed he was conducting legitimate science. He stood among the piles of corpses and believed he was advancing human knowledge. This is the ultimate corruption of the intellect. Brandt had divorced his mind from his heart so completely that he could watch a fellow human being be dissected alive and feel nothing but scientific curiosity. He had forgotten the most basic tenet of medicine, that every life is sacred. In his quest to save the German army, he destroyed the very humanity he claimed to be fighting for. As the Allies closed in and the Third Reich began to crumble, Brandt did not stop. The experiments continued until the very end, a testament to a man who had become so consumed by his own God complex that he could no longer distinguish between a hospital ward and a torture chamber. The war was ending, but for Karl Brandt, the reckoning was just beginning. The world was about to see the contents of his laboratories, and the sight would shake the conscience of mankind forever. When the guns finally fell silent in May of 1945, and the smoke cleared from the ruins of Europe, the world was forced to look into the abyss. The Third Reich had fallen, and its leaders were dragged from their bunkers and hiding holes to answer for crimes that were so vast, so unprecedented, that new laws had to be written just to prosecute them. Among the generals and the politicians stood the doctors, and standing at the front of the line, chin held high, was Karl Brandt. The doctor's trial at Nuremberg was not just a legal proceeding, it was a battle for the soul of medicine. As Brandt sat in the dock, wearing a suit and headphones, listening to the translation of the atrocities he had orchestrated, he did not look like a broken man. He did not weep. He did not beg for forgiveness. He sat with the icy calm of a man who believed history would eventually vindicate him. To him, the judges were not the arbiters of justice. They were simply the victors imposing their will. The most terrifying moment of the trial was not the evidence of the gas chambers or the freezing tanks. It was Brandt's defense. He argued that he was no different from a general ordering soldiers to their deaths. He argued that in times of crisis, the individual means nothing, and the survival of the state means everything. He looked at the court and essentially asked, "Would you not sacrifice one life to save 100? It is a question that haunts us because it mimics the logic we sometimes use in our own modern ethical dilemmas. But Brandt had forgotten that a doctor is not a general. A doctor is a guardian. When he made that argument, He proved that he had completely severed the link between his intellect and his humanity. On August 20th, 1947, the gavel fell. Guilty. The sentence was death by hanging. Even then, Brandt remained defiant. He spent his final days in Landsberg prison, writing, thinking, and maintaining his delusion of righteousness until the very end. The date was June 2nd, 1948. Brandt was led to the gallows. It is said that he walked with a steady step. He stood on the trapdoor, looking out at the witnesses, and attempted to deliver one final speech. He wanted to have the last word. He wanted to frame his death as a martyrdom for science. He began to speak. "It is no shame to stand upon the scaffold." But the world had heard enough. The executioner did not let him finish. A black hood was thrown over his head, cutting off his voice mid-sentence. The trapdoor opened. The rope snapped tight. The doctor who had played God was finally silenced by the gravity of mortality. But the story of Karl Brandt did not end with the snap of his neck. In the wake of his crimes, the world realized that we could never again trust science to police itself. Out of the ashes of his victims rose the Nuremberg Code. For the first time in history, the concept of informed consent was codified into law. Every time you go to a hospital today and sign a form before a surgery, every time a new drug is tested with strict ethical guidelines, you are seeing the shadow of Karl Brandt. The rules that protect us today were written in the blood of those he murdered. As we look back on this dark chapter, we must ask ourselves, is the spirit of Karl Brandt truly dead? We live in an age of genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and debates over euthanasia. We are once again standing on the precipice of playing God. We have the technology to edit human genomes, to decide who is fit and who is flawed. The temptation to improve the human race, to prioritize efficiency over empathy, is just as strong now as it was in 1939. The story of Karl Brandt is not a history lesson, it is a warning. It reminds us that education is not the same as morality. It reminds us that a man can listen to Beethoven, read Goethe, save a life in the morning, and order a massacre in the afternoon. Evil does not always arrive with a pitchfork. Sometimes it arrives with a stethoscope and a smile. We must never forget the children like Gerhard Knauer, the patients on the gray buses, and the prisoners in the freezing water. They were not human material. They were us. They were people who laughed, loved, and feared, whose lives were stolen by a man who forgot that the value of a life is not measured by its utility to the state, but by the simple, sacred fact of its existence. Karl Brandt died believing he was a visionary, but history has rendered its true verdict. He was not a visionary. He was a man who lost his way in the dark, and in doing so, showed us how fragile our own humanity truly is. Let this story be a permanent scar on our collective memory, a reminder that science without compassion is the most dangerous weapon ever created. When you look at a doctor's white coat, remember that it is a symbol of trust, a trust that must be earned every single day. The moment we decide that one life matters less than another, the ghost of Karl Brandt returns to the room. Let us ensure that he remains in the past and that his cold, calculated silence is never given a voice again.